A little black girl goes into a store, but a mean saleswoman thinks she is stealing. The saleswoman gets really angry and hits her. Then the police come and put handcuffs on her, even though the store belongs to her dad. What happens next will surprise you. Make sure to watch until the end. Don't forget to hit subscribe and tell us what you would do if you were her dad. The fancy jewelry store sparkled under the soft lights. Polished glass and shiny gems made it look magical. Maya, an 11-year-old girl with dark eyes and tight braids in her hair, stood in awe as she looked through the thick glass display cases. Inside were beautiful rings, necklaces, and earrings. This store belonged to her father, and every time she visited after school, it felt like stepping into a fairy tale. Today, her father was not there. He had gone out for an important meeting. Maya didn't mind being alone in the front showroom. She loved wandering through the aisles while her father worked in his office. The beautiful jewelry sparkled with magic, making her feel calm and amazed. As she walked slowly between the display cases, tracing the smooth glass with her fingers, Maya felt someone watching her. She looked up and saw the new saleswoman, Miss Davis. She was tall, with sharp features, and had a frown that made her look unfriendly. Maya had seen Miss Davis a few times before, but had never talked to her. The woman always seemed cold and distant, even when Maya's father was around. Trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling of being watched, Maya turned back to the displays. Her eyes lit up when she spotted a beautiful pair of diamond earrings. They were small and delicate, sparkling like stars. She leaned in closer to get a better look. But then, as she leaned in, her hand accidentally brushed against the edge of the display, and one of the earrings slipped from its stand. Before she could react, the earring fell to the glass shelf and tumbled to the floor with a soft clink. Maya froze, her heart racing. She crouched down to pick up the earring, her small hands shaking. Before she could even touch it, Miss Davis was there. "What do you think you're doing?" The woman's voice was sharp and loud. Maya looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drop it," she stammered, her voice trembling. Miss Davis sneered at her. "Didn't mean to drop it or didn't mean to steal it?" Her words felt like an accusation. Maya's breath caught in her throat. "I wasn't trying to steal it. It was an accident. I swear." But Miss Davis wasn't listening. She stepped closer, towering over Maya. "I knew it the moment you walked in here. People like you don't belong in a place like this," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You thought you could just take what you wanted, didn't you?" Maya shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I wasn't trying to." But before she could say more, Miss Davis slapped her across the face. The sound echoed in the quiet store, and Maya stumbled backward, clutching her cheek. The shock made her fall to the cold marble floor with a painful thud. For a moment, she lay there too shocked to move, tears streaming down her face. Miss Davis stood over her, breathing heavily, looking pleased as if she had been waiting for this moment to unleash her anger on someone weaker. Maya felt small and scared, trembling as her cheek stung from the slap. Miss Davis leaned down, her voice a cruel whisper. "You're nothing but a little thief, and thieves get what they deserve." Then she straightened up and pulled out her phone, dialing the police. Her voice was calm as she reported, "Yes, I'd like to report an attempted theft at the jewelry store. We have a young girl here who tried to steal one of our diamond earrings. Yes, I've restrained her. Please send someone immediately." Maya's heart sank. The police? She hadn't done it. It was just an accident. But Miss Davis didn't care, and the police were already on their way. "Please," Maya whimpered, trying to sit up. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "Shut up," Miss Davis snapped. "I don't want to hear your lies. The police will deal with you." Maya sobbed quietly, hugging her knees to her chest. She had never felt so scared and helpless in her life. When the door to the store opened with a jingle, 2 police officers stepped inside. They looked tall and serious, their uniforms crisp and their faces stern. They quickly noticed Maya on the floor with tears streaming down her face. One officer crouched down in front of her, looking hard at her. "Is this true, young lady? Did you try to steal that earring?" Maya shook her head frantically, her tears blurring her vision. "No, I didn't. It was an accident. I didn't mean to drop it." But the officer's face stayed serious. "You're going to have to come with us," he said coldly. Maya's heart raced. "What? No, please, I didn't do anything." The other officer grabbed her arm and pulled her roughly to her feet. Maya cried out in pain, but they didn't seem to care. They forced her hands behind her back and put cold metal handcuffs around her small wrists. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was deafening, and Maya felt like she was in a nightmare. How could this be happening? How could they think she was a thief? "No, please," Maya cried, struggling against the tight grip of the officers. "I didn't steal anything." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The officers began dragging her toward the door. Her small body stumbled as they pulled her along. She looked back at Miss Davis, hoping for some help, but the woman only smiled, pleased with the chaos she had caused. Maya felt dizzy as they shoved her into the back of the police car, slamming the door behind her. She sat there trembling and crying, her wrists aching from the cuffs. The back seat of the police car was cold and uncomfortable. She could feel the metal biting into her wrists, even though she tried to stay still. The tears on her cheeks had dried, but new ones were forming as she tried to understand what had just happened. Her mind raced with fear, but there was nothing she could do. She had been taken from her father's store, the place that had always felt safe. Now, she felt like a criminal, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. The police car sped through the streets, and Maya stared out the window, watching the city blur by. She had never been in a police car before and couldn't believe this was happening. She was just a little girl, and now she was in handcuffs like she was dangerous. Would they take her to jail? Would she be locked up with real criminals? The thought made her shake, and her breath came in quick gasps as panic rose in her chest. Finally, the police car stopped outside the store, and the two officers climbed out, slamming their doors. Maya pressed herself into the corner of the back seat, wishing she could disappear. She couldn't bear to face them again, but she heard their voices as one of the officers opened the back door. Miss Davis was waiting outside on the sidewalk, her smirk wider than ever. "Come on out, you go," the officer barked, grabbing Maya's arm and pulling her out of the car. She stumbled forward, struggling to keep her balance. Miss Davis didn't even look at her. Instead, her eyes were focused on the officers, as if she was in charge. "I told you she's a thief," Miss Davis said confidently. "I caught her trying to steal one of our diamond earrings. I did the right thing by calling you." The officer holding Maya nodded. "We'll take care of it," he said. Maya's stomach twisted with fear. They believed Miss Davis. They actually believed her, even though none of it was true. One officer bent down, looking Maya straight in the eye. "You need to start telling the truth, young lady," he said firmly. "Did you take that earring?" Maya shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't. It was an accident. I swear." But her words seemed to bounce off them. The other officer glanced at Miss Davis, who nodded like she was proud. "That's what they all say," she muttered. Maya's heart sank deeper into her chest. She felt trapped, helpless, as if there was nothing she could do to make them believe her. It was like the truth didn't matter. They had already decided what she was, and nothing she said would change their minds. The officer who had questioned her stood up and turned to his partner. "Let's take her inside and get everything sorted out," he said. Maya's heart raced faster. Back inside the store, she had already been embarrassed once. What would happen now? Without another word, they marched her back into the jewelry store, and her feet dragged as she tried to keep up with their long strides. The store looked just like it did a little while ago before everything changed for Maya. But now, everything felt different. The lights were too bright, and the shiny surfaces felt cold and empty. It wasn't a fun place anymore. It felt scary. Miss Davis walked behind Maya, her high heels clicking on the marble floor, making Maya feel sick. The police officer pointed to a small corner by the front counter and told Maya to sit on one of the stools. He put his hand on her shoulder, making sure she didn't try to leave. Maya sat up straight, feeling very nervous. She wanted to scream or run away, but her voice wouldn't come out. All she could do was sit and watch Miss Davis talking to the police. Miss Davis was telling them a made-up story about how she caught Maya trying to steal an earring. "I've seen her in here before," Miss Davis said, sounding mean. "I knew something was wrong the moment she walked in." The police officers nodded and wrote notes while Maya sat in horror. How could they believe Miss Davis? None of it was true. Suddenly, the store door opened and Maya's heart raced. It was her dad. He walked in looking calm, but as soon as he saw Maya with the police, his face got serious. "What's going on here?" he asked in a low voice that sounded dangerous. Miss Davis turned to him, a big smile on her face. "Mr. Williams, I'm glad you're here. I took care of everything. This girl," she pointed at Maya without looking at her, "was caught trying to steal one of our diamond earrings. I called the police and they've handled it." Maya's dad looked shocked. "This girl?" he repeated, his voice getting colder. Miss Davis nodded happily. "Yes, sir. I did what I had to do. She was a thief." Mr. Williams stood still for a moment, then his face got really angry. "That girl," he said slowly, "is my daughter." Miss Davis's eyes got wide, and her smile disappeared. "What?" she stammered, her voice shaking. Maya's dad stepped closer, looking furious. "You called the police on my daughter?" he asked, his voice rising. "You accused her of stealing?" Miss Davis took a step back, realizing she had made a big mistake. I didn't know, sir," she said. He turned to the officers. "Take those handcuffs off my daughter right now," he ordered. The officers looked at each other, not sure what to do. "Sir, we were just following the rules," one said. "I said take them off," Mr. Williams shouted, clearly upset. The officers hurried to unlock the handcuffs, freeing Maya. She rubbed her sore wrists and looked up at her dad, feeling a mix of relief and fear. Mr. Williams knelt down in front of her and gently touched her cheek. "Are you okay, baby girl?" he asked softly. Maya nodded, but her voice was too shaky to answer. She hugged him tightly, hiding her face in his chest as she cried quietly. He held her close, forgetting his anger for a moment. But then Mr. Williams stood up, looking at Miss Davis, who was still scared. "You're fired," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "Get out of my store!" Miss Davis opened her mouth to argue, but Mr. Williams's angry look made her stop. She nodded weakly, looking very pale, and walked toward the door. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Mr. Williams, we can't let her go yet. We need to check on the accusation." "There's nothing to check," Mr. Williams interrupted, sounding very firm. "You've already caused enough trouble." Miss Davis's hands shook as she took out her phone. She was starting to understand that she had made a big mistake. She had slapped a young girl and accused her of stealing without knowing that the girl was Mr. Williams's daughter. Now, she felt regret for acting so quickly. She hoped that calling the police would make Mr. Williams happy, thinking she was just trying to protect his store. Her fingers shook as she dialed his number. She had only worked for him a few months, but she knew he was a strict man who didn't like mistakes. Finally, Mr. Williams answered. "Mr. Williams speaking," he said in a calm voice. Miss Davis straightened up, trying to sound confident. "Mr. Williams, it's Miss Davis. I wanted to let you know that we had a situation at the store today." There was a pause, and Miss Davis felt nervous, waiting for his response. "Yes?" he asked, sounding curious. "A young girl came in and tried to steal a diamond earring," she said quickly. "I caught her and I called the police. They're here now." Mr. Williams took a deep breath. "You caught a thief?" he asked slowly. Yes, sir. She's around 11 years old. I thought she was acting suspiciously, Miss Davis replied, trying to sound serious. I had no choice but to call the police. After a moment, Mr. Williams said, Good job, Miss Davis. You did the right thing by calling them. I appreciate you keeping an eye on the store. Miss Davis felt relief wash over her. Thank you, sir. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I'll be there in a few minutes to handle the situation myself, Mr. Williams said. Miss Davis felt even happier, thinking her boss was proud of her. She might even get a reward. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I'll wait for you, she said gratefully. She hung up and turned to the police officers, a small smile starting to show on her face. Mr. Williams is on his way. He knows everything now. The officers nodded, but they still looked unsure, like they felt something wasn't right. Miss Davis ignored them and looked at Maya, who sat on the stool, pale and with tears on her face. Maya looked even smaller now, and for a moment Miss Davis felt something strange inside her. Miss Davis felt nervous. Was it possible she had made a mistake? Maybe she had acted too quickly. But no, she shook the thought away. She was in charge here. She made the call, and her boss supported her. Time passed slowly as everyone in the store waited for Mr. Williams to arrive. The police officers stood quietly to the side, looking at each other as if they were wondering what was happening. But they didn't try to free Maya or check what was going on. They seemed okay with letting Mr. Williams deal with things when he arrived. Then the door opened. Mr. Williams walked into the store. He was tall and wore a nice suit, and everyone noticed him right away. Miss Davis felt more confident seeing him. This was her chance to explain everything and show him that she had done the right thing. Mr. Williams, she called out, trying to sound cheerful, but Mr. Williams didn't respond right away. He looked around the room, taking in the police officers, the store, and finally stopping at Maya. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then he saw the handcuffs and his face changed. He looked angry. What is going on here? He shouted, his voice sharp and loud. Miss Davis hesitated, her planned explanation suddenly not feeling good enough. Sir, she started, but Mr. Williams wasn't listening. He stepped closer to Maya, who was sitting on a stool, looking scared and crying. Maya? He asked softly but firmly. Maya looked up at her dad, her lip trembling. Daddy, I didn't do anything. I swear! Mr. Williams's jaw tightened as he turned back to Miss Davis. What did you do? He asked, his voice calm but with a hint of danger. Miss Davis opened her mouth but couldn't find any words. The reality of what she had done hit her hard. She had accused the boss's daughter of stealing and even called the police on her. I thought, she stammered, her voice shaky. You thought? Mr. Williams cut her off, his voice icy. You thought my daughter was a thief? Miss Davis felt panic rise in her. Sir, I didn't know she was your daughter. I saw her drop the earring, and I thought, You thought wrong, he shouted back, his voice calm but very angry. He turned to the police officers. Take those handcuffs off my daughter. Now. The officers seemed to wake up from a daze. One of them hurried over and unlocked the cuffs from Maya's wrists. The other officer took a step back, looking uncomfortable with what had just happened. Maya rubbed her wrists, which were red and sore from the handcuffs. She looked up at her dad, tears in her eyes, and then hugged him tightly, hiding her face against his chest. Mr. Williams held her close, his anger bubbling just under the surface as he looked at Miss Davis. You accused my daughter of stealing, he repeated, his voice low and filled with anger. You called the police on her? Miss Davis could only nod, feeling terrified. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice barely a sound. Mr. Williams's eyes flashed with rage. You should have known better, he said coldly. You're fired. Get out of my store. Miss Davis's heart sank. Please, sir. I said get out. His voice was firm, leaving no room for arguing. Miss Davis hesitated for a moment, but then quickly turned and left the store, her head down in shame. The officers watched her go, feeling uneasy because they knew they had been part of the mistake. After Miss Davis left, Mr. Williams turned back to the police officers. "I don't care what she told you," he said firmly. "My daughter didn't steal anything. This was all a mistake, and I expect an apology." The officers exchanged worried looks. One of them stepped forward, his face red. "Mr. Williams, we're sorry. We were just following the report we got. We didn't realize—" "You didn't realize," Mr. Williams interrupted, his voice sharp. "You didn't even check the facts." The officer swallowed hard. "We didn't mean any harm, sir." "Get out," Mr. Williams said quietly but firmly. The officers quickly left the store, and Mr. Williams left standing with Maya still holding him. He let out a deep breath, feeling a little better that it was over. But for Miss Davis, it wasn't over yet. The store felt very quiet after the police left, as if the air was thick with leftover tension. Mr. Williams held his daughter close, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. He felt many emotions: rage, disbelief, and a strong need to protect Maya. He pulled back from the hug and crouched down to look her in the eyes. "Are you okay, baby girl?" he asked softly, his voice full of concern. Maya nodded weakly, but her eyes still looked scared. She looked down, trembling as she fiddled with her shirt hem. The marks from the handcuffs were still visible on her wrists, and Mr. Williams's heart hurt when he saw them. "I didn't steal anything, Daddy," she whispered, her voice so small it almost broke his heart. "It was an accident. I swear I didn't mean to drop the earring." He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know, sweetheart. I know you didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Williams straightened up and looked toward the front door where Miss Davis had left. The weight of what had happened hit him fully now. His own employee had accused his daughter of theft. Not only had she made a mistake, but she had also called the police and scared his child for no reason. Even worse, he had praised her at first without knowing the truth. His jaw tightened again, and he felt anger rise inside him. But he knew yelling wouldn't help Maya feel better. What was most important was that she was safe, and Miss Davis needed to face the consequences for her actions. He took a deep breath to calm himself and then led Maya over to the front counter where she could sit for a moment. "Stay here, okay?" he said softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'll take care of everything." Maya nodded, her eyes still filled with fear from what she had just been through. She watched her father move to the center of the store. His shoulders were strong, and he looked determined as he began to walk back and forth, thinking about how everything had gone wrong. Miss Davis had acted out of ignorance and prejudice, letting her wrong ideas guide her actions. But this wasn't just about her. It was also about the police who had jumped to conclusions. It was about a system that allowed something like this to happen at all. Just then, the door opened again, and to his surprise, Miss Davis walked back inside. She looked scared, and her face was pale. The confident look she had before was gone. She seemed to know that something bad was going to happen, but she might have come back to try to save her job or explain her actions. Mr. Williams's eyes locked onto hers, and the air felt tense between them. "What are you doing here?" he asked coldly, his voice steady but with an edge that made Miss Davis flinch. I came back to explain," she stammered, nervously clasping her hands together. "Mr. Williams, I swear I didn't know she was your daughter. If I had known." "If you had known?" Mr. Williams interrupted, his voice rising a little. "That's your excuse? Are you saying that if it had been another little black girl, your actions would have been okay?" Miss Davis's eyes widened, and she tried to find the right words. No, sir. That's not what I meant. I thought I was doing the right thing by protecting the store." "Protecting the store?" Mr. Williams repeated, looking shocked. "By putting handcuffs on an innocent child? By calling the police on her for an accident? Do you even hear yourself?" Miss Davis's face turned red with embarrassment. She looked at Maya, who was sitting quietly behind the counter. Maya's tear-streaked face reminded everyone of what had happened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Williams," she whispered, her voice barely loud enough to hear. "I was wrong. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Mr. Williams's jaw tightened. "It's too late for apologies, Miss Davis. You crossed a line that you can't uncross. You let your prejudice blind you to the truth, and because of that, my daughter suffered." Miss Davis opened her mouth to protest, but Mr. Williams held up his hand to silence her. "You're fired," he said firmly. "I want you out of this store immediately. Don't expect any references or final payments. You've done enough damage." Tears filled Miss Davis's eyes. She began to plead, her voice desperate. "Please, sir, I can't lose this job. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I don't want to hear any more excuses." Mr. Williams snapped, his patience wearing thin. "You should have thought about the consequences of your actions before you treated my daughter like a criminal." Miss Davis hesitated, but then nodded weakly. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," she muttered one last time before walking toward the door. Just then, the same two police officers who had left earlier came back into the store. They looked serious and seemed surprised to return so soon. "Mr. Williams," one of the officers said cautiously, "we received a call from headquarters. We're here to take a formal statement from your employee about the assault on your daughter." Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow, curious. "A formal statement?" The officer nodded, then looked at Miss Davis. "We've been told that this situation needs to be investigated further. There's been an accusation of assault against a minor, and we need to gather all the details." Miss Davis turned pale and took a step back, trembling. "Assault?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. But the officers were already moving toward her, their faces cold and serious. One officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs while the other read Miss Davis her rights. "You're being placed under arrest for assaulting a minor," the officer said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Miss Davis's breath caught in her throat as she looked helplessly at Mr. Williams. Her eyes were wide with fear. "Please, sir," she begged. "I didn't mean to hurt her. It was all a misunderstanding." But Mr. Williams remained serious. He watched as the officers placed handcuffs around Miss Davis's wrists, moving quickly and efficiently. It felt right to him that the woman who had hurt his daughter would now face the consequences of her actions. As the officers led Miss Davis toward the door, she glanced back at Mr. Williams one last time. Her face was filled with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but this time her words were barely heard. The door closed behind them, and the store fell silent once more. Mr. Williams took a slow breath, feeling a strange sense of closure. Justice had been served, but it didn't take away the pain Maya had felt. He walked back over to his daughter, who had been watching everything with wide, tearful eyes. "Is she gone?" Maya asked softly. Mr. Williams nodded, crouching down beside her. "She's gone," he said gently. "She won't hurt you again." Maya bit her lip, still shaking with fear. "Daddy, I was so scared." Mr. Williams pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed against his chest. "I know, baby girl. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. But it's over now. You're safe." As he held her, the weight of the day started to lift. For the first time since everything happened, Mr. Williams felt a sense of peace. His daughter was safe, and the woman who had hurt her was facing the consequences. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was enough for now. The air in the store still felt heavy, like the tension had settled in every corner. Mr. Williams stayed by Maya's side, his hand protectively resting on her shoulder. He could feel her small body shaking, and it hurt his heart to know she had gone through something so cruel. But at least now justice seemed to be happening. Miss Davis had been arrested, and the officers were finally treating the situation seriously. Mr. Williams stood tall, thinking about everything that had happened. He replayed every detail in his mind, from when Miss Davis accused his daughter to how the police believed her lies, How had it come to this? How had his own employee, someone he trusted to follow the store's values, turned out to be so filled with prejudice? And more importantly, how had the police officers, trained professionals, failed to see through such a clear falsehood? He turned to Maya, crouching down to look into her tear-filled eyes. "Are you sure you're okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Maya nodded, her voice shaky. "I'm okay now, Daddy, but I was really scared. I thought they were going to take me to jail." Her voice cracked, and fresh tears filled her eyes as she spoke. Mr. Williams felt anger rise again at the thought of his innocent daughter being treated like a criminal. "No one's taking you anywhere," he said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong. I won't let anyone hurt you like that ever again." Maya gave a small nod, wiping her eyes. She clung to her father as if she were afraid to let go, thinking the nightmare might start all over again. Mr. Williams held her close, his own determination growing. This wasn't just about today. It was about making sure nothing like this ever happened again. Not just to Maya, but to anyone. Just then, the door to the store opened again, and a different figure walked in, an officer in plain clothes. He had a serious look, but he didn't seem unkind. Behind him, the two uniformed officers from before came back in, looking more respectful now. "Mr. Williams," the plainclothes officer said, stepping forward and shaking his hand. "I'm Lieutenant Grant. I've been sent to oversee the investigation into what happened here today." Mr. Williams shook the man's hand firmly, but kept a guarded expression. "I appreciate that, Lieutenant," he said, "but I want you to understand what really happened here. My daughter was falsely accused, assaulted, and nearly arrested, all because of a racist employee who jumped to the wrong conclusion. This was a case of prejudice, plain and simple." Lieutenant Grant nodded, glancing briefly at Maya before looking back at Mr. Williams. "I understand your concerns, sir. I assure you we're taking this very seriously. Miss Davis has been taken into custody, and we're gathering statements to make sure the proper charges are filed." Mr. Williams crossed his arms over his chest, "That's not enough. I want accountability from everyone involved in this, including your officers." He pointed at the two uniformed policemen standing behind Harris. "They didn't just take her word for it. They acted on it without giving my daughter a chance to defend herself." The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware they had made a mistake. One of them, Officer Brooks, stepped forward, his expression tight with regret. "Mr. Williams, we're sorry for how things played out. We were responding to the call as it came in." Mr. Williams was very upset. "You put an 11-year-old girl in handcuffs?" he shouted, his voice full of disbelief. "You believed everything Miss Davis told you without even asking my daughter what happened. How is that fair?" Officer Chen, another police officer, spoke up. "We didn't mean to make things worse. We were just following the rules because of what we were told." "Those were lies," Mr. Williams replied angrily. "You didn't even try to find out the truth." Lieutenant Grant stepped in to calm things down. "I understand why you're upset, Mr. Williams. We will look into this carefully. We will check the body camera videos from both officers and do a full investigation. If the rules were not followed, there will be consequences." Mr. Williams stared at Lieutenant Grant. "It's not just about following the rules. It's about treating people with kindness. My daughter was treated like a criminal just because of the color of her skin, and your officers didn't question it." Lieutenant Grant looked back at him, serious. "That's why we're investigating, sir. I promise you this will be taken seriously." Mr. Williams took a deep breath and relaxed a bit. He could see that Lieutenant Grant was serious about fixing things. "Fine," he said, "but I want to know everything that happens during this process." "Of course," Lieutenant Grant agreed. "I will make sure you get regular updates." Mr. Williams nodded, though he still felt sad. The officers stood quietly for a moment, and then Lieutenant Grant turned to Maya, Mr. Williams's daughter. His expression softened. Miss Johnson, I'm very sorry for what happened to you today. No child should have to go through that. Maya looked up at him, her eyes still full of fear. She didn't say anything but nodded slowly, holding her father's hand tightly. Lieutenant Grant then signaled for the officers to follow him out of the store. As they were leaving, Officer Brooks turned back to Mr. Williams. I'm sorry again, he said softly. I know this doesn't fix what happened, but I really am sorry. Mr. Williams didn't answer right away. After a long pause, he nodded slightly. Just make sure this never happens again. Officer Brooks nodded sadly and then left the store with the others. Once the door closed behind them, the store was quiet again, leaving Mr. Williams and Maya alone. The day had been very tiring and heavy for them. Mr. Williams looked down at his daughter, who was still holding on to him. His heart ached for her. No child should have to feel what she felt. But he knew this was not over. There were still questions to ask, justice to find, and changes to make. He couldn't let this end with just Miss Davis being arrested. He had to make sure this became a chance for real change, not just in his store, but in how people like Maya were treated in the world. He knelt down beside her, gently holding her face in his hands. We're going to be okay, he whispered. I promise this won't happen again. Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with trust, and for the first time since everything happened, she smiled a little. Daddy, she said quietly, thank you for protecting me. Mr. Williams felt a rush of love and pride. He hugged her tightly. Always, baby girl, he whispered. Always. As they stood there together in the quiet of the store, Mr. Williams promised himself he wouldn't let this be just another sad story that people forget. He would fight for his daughter, for others like her, and for a world where no child would ever feel the fear Maya felt that day. In the following days, Mr. Williams worked hard to see that justice was served. Maya went back to school, trying to live her life normally, but Mr. Williams could see she was still nervous. Whenever the store door opened with a jingle, she flinched a little. It was hard for her to forget what happened, and Mr. Williams knew it would take time to heal. The investigation into Miss Davis's actions moved quickly because Mr. Williams made sure it got attention. The body camera videos from the police and from the store's security cameras showed what really happened. There was no question about Miss Davis hurting Maya or about her lies. The footage showed everything from when Miss Davis hit Maya to how she acted coldly afterward. Because of this, Miss Davis was charged with assaulting Maya, endangering a child, guilt theft, and lying to the police. She was not allowed to leave jail, and her trial was set for the next few weeks. Mr. Williams spent the days gathering a strong legal team. He wanted to make sure everything was done right. His lawyers were some of the best in the city, and they promised him that justice would come quickly and fairly. But he wanted more than just justice for Maya. He wanted to make sure no other child had to face what Maya had faced. The store also changed. Every worker, from cashiers to salespeople, had to go through special training on how to treat everyone with kindness and respect. Mr. Williams told them there would be zero tolerance for any kind of prejudice. He was there for the training sessions, making sure everyone understood how serious the situation was. But now, standing outside the courthouse, Mr. Williams felt heavy with all that had happened. The trial was about to start, and Miss Davis was going to face the consequences of her actions. This was a moment for everyone, not just for her, but also for the system that allowed such a thing to happen. As Mr. Williams entered the courthouse, he felt determined. He wasn't just there for Maya. He was there for every child who had been treated unfairly, for every person judged by their skin color. This was about more than one incident. It was about changing the system. Inside the courthouse, the air was tense. Miss Davis sat at the defense table, looking very different from the confident woman she had been in the store. Now her face was pale and her eyes looked scared as she glanced around, hoping for a way out. But there was no escape now. The prosecutor stood up and began explaining the case against Miss Davis. He talked about her actions that day, how she had hurt Maya and lied to the police. The jury listened carefully, their faces growing serious. Mr. Sturford Williams watched Miss Davis closely. She didn't seem arrogant anymore. She looked like a woman who had made a big mistake and knew it. But Mr. Williams didn't feel sorry for her. She had chosen to let her prejudice guide her actions, and now she needed to face the consequences. The trial went quickly. The evidence against Miss Davis was very strong, and her defense was weak. Her lawyer tried to say she was scared and thought Maya was a threat, but the videos showed she acted out of hate, not fear. Mr. Williams insisted Maya not have to testify. She had already been through enough, and he didn't want her to feel scared again in front of strangers. Instead, the prosecutor used the video evidence and the police officers' testimonies, who admitted they acted too quickly without checking the situation. In the end, it was clear that Miss Davis was going to be found guilty. The jury talked for only a few hours before coming back with a guilty verdict for all her charges. Mr. Williams felt relieved, though it didn't take away the pain of what had happened. As the judge gave Miss Davis her punishment, several years in prison for assault and lying to the police, Mr. Williams felt satisfied that justice had been served, at least partly, but he knew this was just the beginning of the changes he wanted to see. After the trial, when Mr. Williams and Maya stood on the courthouse steps, reporters rushed forward with cameras, asking questions. Mr. Williams raised his hand to ask for silence. "I have something to say," he started, his voice steady and strong. "What happened to my daughter should never happen to anyone anywhere. This was an act of hatred driven by prejudice, and today justice was served. But this isn't just about Miss Davis. It's about making sure our society, our police, and our communities no longer accept discrimination of any kind." He looked down at Maya, who stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. "This is for her and for every child who deserves to grow up in a world where they are judged by who they are, not the color of their skin." The crowd of reporters murmured in agreement. Mr. Williams turned to walk away, and Maya by his side. As they walked to their car, Mr. Williams felt a sense of peace. He had fought for justice and won. More importantly, he had begun to make changes. This wasn't just about one event. It was about creating a better future for his daughter and all the kids who would come after her. He squeezed Maya's hand gently, and she looked up at him with bright, hopeful eyes. "We're gonna be okay, Daddy," she said softly. Mr. Williams smiled down at her, his heart filled with pride. "Yes, baby girl," he replied. "We're going to be okay." For the first time since that terrible day, Mr. Williams really believed it. They were going to be okay. The future was uncertain, but together they would face whatever came next with strength, courage, and the knowledge that justice, in the end, always wins. But justice doesn't always come easy. In the end, the truth came out, and those responsible faced the consequences. Yet, the scars of the past remind us that the fight against prejudice is far from over. If this happened to your child, what would you do? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to see more amazing stories and check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them.